love. It's the one thing that can break us, heal us, and change us in ways we never imagined. But what happens when someone is so afraid of love that they build walls so high no one can climb them? This is the story of Ethan Cole, a man who had everything the world could offer: wealth, power, success. Yet behind the closed doors of his empire, he was a prisoner of his own fears, haunted by a past he couldn't escape. And then there was Sophie Carter, a woman who believed that even the most broken hearts could be mended. She wasn't looking for love, but she found it in the most unexpected place, in the cracks of Ethan's carefully constructed walls. This isn't just a story about romance. It's about healing, about finding the courage to let someone in, and about the kind of love that doesn't just change lives, it saves them. So if you've ever felt lost, if you've ever been afraid to love, or if you've ever wondered if it's possible to start over, this story is for you. Stay with us, because what happens next might just change the way you see love forever. The city skyline glows under the soft hues of twilight, a testament to human ambition and innovation. At the heart of it all stands Ethan Cole, a name synonymous with power, brilliance, and mystery. As the CEO of Cole Tech Industries, Ethan has revolutionized the tech world, creating systems that connect billions of people across the globe. Yet for all his success, Ethan himself remains disconnected, a man hidden behind walls of his own making. Ethan is a recluse, rarely seen in public, and even more rarely seen in the company of women. Rumors swirl about his peculiar behavior: no female employees in his inner circle, no public relationships, and an almost obsessive need for control. But what the world doesn't know is that Ethan's avoidance of women isn't a choice, it's a condition. A rare and debilitating anxiety disorder causes him to experience severe physical and emotional reactions when in close proximity to women. For years, he's managed to keep this secret hidden, building a life of strict routines and unyielding rules to protect himself. But Ethan's carefully constructed world is about to be shaken. Enter Sophie Carter, a fearless investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering the human stories behind the headlines. Sophie has been following Ethan's career for years, intrigued by his genius, but even more fascinated by the man behind the empire. When she begins to dig deeper into his life, she discovers the cracks in his perfect facade, and she's determined to uncover the truth. As their paths collide, Sophie's relentless pursuit of answers will force Ethan to confront the fears he's spent a lifetime avoiding, and in the process, both of them will discover that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves are the very things that keep us from truly living. Ethan Cole's world is one of precision, control, and isolation. From the outside, his life seems like the pinnacle of success. His penthouse, perched atop the tallest skyscraper in the city, is a marvel of modern architecture, sleek, minimalist, and impossibly perfect. Every detail, from the temperature of the air to the placement of the furniture, is meticulously curated to reflect his need for order. But beneath the surface of this pristine existence lies a man trapped by his own fears. Ethan's daily routine is a testament to his obsession with control. He wakes at exactly 5:30 a.m., his mornings beginning with a solitary workout in his private gym, followed by a carefully prepared breakfast delivered by his all-male staff. His office, located on the top floor of Cole Tech Tower, is a fortress of innovation where only a select few are allowed access. His assistant, Ryan, is the gatekeeper of this world, ensuring that Ethan's strict protocols are followed to the letter. One of these protocols is unbreakable. No women are allowed in Ethan's immediate vicinity. It's a rule that has baffled his employees and fueled endless speculation in the media. Some say it's arrogance, others whisper about a traumatic past, but no one knows the truth. The reality is far more complex. Ethan suffers from a rare psychosomatic condition that triggers severe anxiety and physical reactions when he's near women. His heart races, his breathing becomes labored, and his body feels like it's shutting down. It's a condition he's lived with since he was a teenager, and it has shaped every aspect of his life. Despite his isolation, Ethan's professional achievements are unparalleled. Coltech Industries is a global powerhouse, responsible for groundbreaking advancements in artificial intelligence and communication technology. Ethan's vision has connected billions of people, yet he himself remains disconnected. He avoids interviews, rarely attends public events, and has never been seen with a romantic partner. To the world, he's a genius enigma, a man who has everything but seems to want nothing. But Ethan's isolation isn't just about his condition. It's also about the pain he carries from his past. In the corner of his office, there's a single photograph of his mother, Margaret Cole, a woman whose warmth and kindness shaped his early years. She was his anchor, his inspiration, and the reason he pursued greatness. But when Ethan was just 16, Margaret died in a tragic car accident. The loss shattered him, and in the aftermath, his condition began to manifest. Over the years, he's convinced himself that keeping people at a distance, especially women, is the only way to protect himself from more pain. Ryan, Ethan's loyal assistant, is one of the few people who truly understands the weight of his burden. He's been with Ethan for years, managing his schedule, enforcing his rules, and shielding him from the outside world. But even Ryan knows that Ethan's walls are starting to crack. "You can't keep living like this," Ryan tells him one morning after yet another sleepless night. "You've built an empire, but at what cost? You're alone, Ethan, and one day, that's going to catch up with you." Ethan brushes off the comment, as he always does, but Ryan's words linger, echoing in the quiet moments when Ethan is left alone with his thoughts. He knows Ryan is right. The walls he's built to protect himself have also become his prison. And as much as he hates to admit it, a part of him wonders if there's a way out. Unbeknownst to Ethan, the first crack in his fortress is already forming. Sophie Carter, the journalist who's been asking questions about him, is determined to uncover the truth. She's relentless, resourceful, and unafraid to challenge the status quo. And, for the first time in years, someone is about to step into Ethan's world, whether he's ready for it or not. Sophie Carter was not the type to back down from a challenge. As an investigative journalist with a reputation for uncovering the untold stories of the world's most powerful figures, she had spent years chasing the truth, no matter how elusive it seemed. And now her sights were set on Ethan Cole, the billionaire CEO who had managed to keep his personal life shrouded in mystery. To Sophie, Ethan wasn't just a story, he was a puzzle, and she was determined to solve it. For weeks, Sophie had been digging into Ethan's life, piecing together fragments of information from interviews, public records, and whispers from former employees. She had learned about his meteoric rise in the tech world, his obsessive need for control, and, most intriguingly, his peculiar aversion to women. The rumors fascinated her. Why would a man who had built a company that connected billions of people go to such lengths to isolate himself? What was he hiding? Sophie knew there was more to the story, and she was determined to find out. Her opportunity came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Sophie had managed to secure a meeting with one of Ethan's senior executives, under the guise of writing a feature on Coltech's latest innovations. But her real goal was to get closer to Ethan himself. Armed with her notebook, recorder, and an unshakable determination, Sophie arrived at Coltech Tower, a gleaming symbol of Ethan's empire. The lobby was as cold and imposing as the man who owned it. Polished marble floors reflected the harsh fluorescent lights, and a massive digital screen displayed the company's latest achievements. Sophie approached the reception desk, her heels clicking against the floor with purpose. "I'm here to see Mr. Ethan Cole," she said, her voice steady. The receptionist, a young man with a nervous smile, glanced at his computer screen. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Cole doesn't take unscheduled meetings." Sophie leaned in slightly, her tone firm but polite. "I'm not leaving until I speak with him. You can tell him that." The receptionist hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle her. Before he could respond, Sophie spotted a group of executives heading toward the elevators. Among them was Ryan, Ethan's trusted assistant. Sophie recognized him from her research and seized the moment. She stepped away from the desk and intercepted Ryan before he could board the elevator. "Mr. Ryan, I'm Sophie Carter. I'm writing a feature on Coltech and I need to speak with Mr. Cole directly, she said, her words quick and precise. Ryan's expression hardened. Mr. Cole doesn't do interviews. If you have questions, you can direct them to our PR department. I'm not here for a PR-approved statement, Sophie shot back. I'm here for the truth, and I think you know as well as I do that the truth doesn't come from press releases. Ryan sighed, clearly annoyed but also impressed by her persistence. Miss Carter, I suggest you leave before you waste any more of your time. But Sophie wasn't about to give up. As Ryan turned to enter the elevator, she slipped past him and pressed the button for the top floor. If Ethan Cole wants me to leave, he can tell me himself, she said, her voice unwavering. The elevator ride to the top floor was tense. Ryan stood beside her, his jaw clenched, while Sophie remained calm, her mind racing with anticipation. When the doors opened, she stepped into Ethan's private office suite, a space that was as meticulously designed as the man himself. The walls were lined with sleek black panels, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city. At the center of the room was a massive desk, behind which sat Ethan Cole. He looked up from his computer, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Sophie. For a moment the room seemed to freeze. Ethan's expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, in his gaze. Who are you and why are you in my office? Ethan's voice was calm but carried an edge of irritation. Sophie stepped forward, her confidence unwavering. I'm Sophie Carter, and I'm here to ask you the questions no one else will. Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't do interviews. This isn't an interview, Sophie replied. This is about the truth. Why do you go to such lengths to avoid women? What are you so afraid of? Her words hit a nerve. Ethan's breathing quickened, and he gripped the edge of his desk as if to steady himself. You have no idea what you're talking about, he said, his voice low and strained. Then help me understand, Sophie pressed. You've built an empire that connects the world, but you've isolated yourself from half of it. Why? Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Get out, he said, his voice rising. Now? Sophie hesitated, her instincts telling her to push further, but she could see the strain in Ethan's face. Reluctantly, she turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she glanced back at him and said, You can hide behind your walls, Mr. Cole, but I'll find a way in. As the door closed behind her, Ethan sank back into his chair, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, someone had dared to challenge him, and it left him shaken. Sophie Carter wasn't one to back down, especially not after her brief but electrifying encounter with Ethan Cole. His reaction had only fueled her curiosity. There was something deeper behind his aversion to women, something more than just a condition. She could see it in his eyes, the fear, the pain, and the anger. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was personal. Sophie was determined to uncover the truth, not just for her article, but because she sensed that Ethan needed someone to understand him, even if he didn't realize it himself. Back at her small but cluttered apartment, Sophie spread out her notes and research on Ethan. Newspaper clippings, old interviews, and corporate press releases were pinned to her corkboard, forming a timeline of his life. She had already pieced together the basics. Ethan Cole, a tech prodigy, had founded Coltech Industries in his early 20s and turned it into a global powerhouse. But his personal life was a blank slate. No relationships, no scandals, no close friends, just a fortress of isolation. Sophie decided to dig deeper into his past. She started with his childhood, reaching out to people who had known him before he became the enigmatic billionaire. After days of phone calls and dead ends, she finally got a lead. Dr. Alan Pierce, a retired professor who had mentored Ethan during his teenage years. Dr. Pierce agreed to meet Sophie at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Over steaming cups of coffee, Dr. Pierce shared his memories of a young Ethan. He was brilliant, no doubt about it, the professor said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. But he was also different, reserved. He didn't trust people easily. even back then. "Did something happen to him?" Sophie asked, leaning forward. "Something that might explain why he's so closed off?" Dr. Pierce hesitated, as if weighing his words. "It was his mother," he finally said. "Margaret Cole. She was everything to him, kind, loving, supportive. But when she died, it broke him. He was never the same after that." Sophie's pen froze mid-scribble. "How did she die?" "Car accident," Dr. Pierce replied, his expression somber. "Ethan was in the car with her. He survived, but she didn't. I think he's carried that guilt with him ever since." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. Sophie realized that Ethan's condition wasn't just physical. It was deeply tied to the trauma of losing his mother. The fear of losing someone he cared about had likely manifested into an aversion to women, a subconscious way of protecting himself from ever feeling that kind of pain again. But Sophie wasn't satisfied with just understanding the why. She wanted to know how Ethan had managed to build such a successful empire while carrying such a heavy burden. Her next step was to speak with people inside Coltech Industries. Using her network of contacts, she arranged a meeting with a former employee who had worked closely with Ethan in the early days of the company. The employee, who asked to remain anonymous, described Ethan as a perfectionist who demanded excellence from everyone around him. "He's brilliant, no doubt," they said. "But he's also distant. It's like he's afraid to let anyone get too close, especially women. I don't think I ever saw him interact with a female colleague." Sophie pressed further. "Did he ever talk about his personal life? His family?" "Never," the employee replied. "But there was this one time. I remember seeing him in his office staring at a photo on his desk. It was of a woman. I think it was his mother. He looked lost." The more Sophie learned, the more she felt a strange connection to Ethan. She, too, had experienced loss. Her father had died in a car accident when she was a teenager, and she had spent years building walls around herself to keep the pain at bay. It wasn't until she became a journalist, chasing stories that mattered, that she began to heal. Maybe, just maybe, she could help Ethan do the same. But Sophie knew that getting through to Ethan wouldn't be easy. He had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people out, and she was just a stranger who had barged into his life uninvited. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. Ethan might not want her help, but Sophie was determined to give it to him anyway. As she sat in her apartment that night, staring at the photo of Ethan and his mother that she had found in an old newspaper article, Sophie made a decision. She wasn't just going to write about Ethan Cole. She was going to confront him again, this time armed with the truth about his past and the hope that she could help him find a way forward. Sophie Carter wasn't one to second-guess herself, but as she stood outside Ethan Cole's penthouse, her heart raced with uncertainty. She had spent days piecing together the fragments of his life, uncovering the pain and trauma that had shaped him into the man he was today. But now, standing on the threshold of his world, she wondered if she was about to push him too far. Still, she knew she couldn't turn back. Ethan needed someone to confront him with the truth, even if he didn't want to hear it. The elevator doors opened, revealing the sleek, minimalist design of Ethan's private residence. The space was as cold and calculated as the man himself. Black and white tones, sharp lines, and not a single personal touch in sight. Sophie stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, and was immediately met by Ryan, Ethan's ever-loyal assistant. "You shouldn't be here," Ryan said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Mr. Cole doesn't take visitors." "I'm not leaving until I speak with him," Sophie replied, her voice steady. "I know the truth about his past, and I think he needs to hear it." Ryan hesitated, his usual confidence faltering. He had seen the toll Ethan's isolation had taken on him over the years, and a part of him wondered if Sophie might be exactly what Ethan needed. With a reluctant sigh, he stepped aside. "He's in his study, but don't expect him to be happy about this." Sophie nodded her thanks and made her way to the study. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see Ethan sitting at his desk, his back to her. He was staring at a photograph in his hands, the same photograph Sophie had seen in her research, the one of him and his mother. For a moment, she hesitated, not wanting to intrude on such a private moment, but then she reminded herself why she was there. She knocked lightly on the door frame. "Ethan!" He stiffened at the sound of her voice, his shoulders tensing as he turned to face her. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation in an instant. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice cold. "I came to talk," Sophie said, stepping into the room. "I know about your mother. I know about the accident." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he set the photograph down on his desk. "You have no right to dig into my past," he said, his tone sharp. "Leave. Now." Sophie didn't flinch. "I'm not here to hurt you, Ethan. I'm here because I think you've been hurting yourself for far too long." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought he might throw her out, but instead he leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "You think you know me? You think you understand what I've been through?" "I don't know everything," Sophie admitted, "but I know enough to see that you've built your entire life around avoiding pain. You've shut yourself off from the world, from people, because you're afraid of losing them. But that's not living, Ethan. That's surviving." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to regain control of his emotions. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "You don't know what it's like to lose the one person who meant everything to you, to feel like it's your fault they're gone." Sophie's heart ached at the raw pain in his voice. "You're right," she said softly. "I don't know what it's like to be you, but I do know what it's like to lose someone. My father died in a car accident when I was 16. For years, I blamed myself. I thought if I had done something differently, he might still be here. But I learned that carrying that guilt doesn't bring them back. It just keeps you stuck in the past." Ethan stopped pacing, his back to her. For a long moment, he said nothing, the silence in the room heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, he turned to face her, his expression softer but still guarded. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," Sophie said. "I just want you to see that you don't have to live like this. You don't have to let your past define you. You've built walls to protect yourself, but those walls are keeping you from the very thing you need most: connection." Ethan stared at her, his defenses crumbling ever so slightly. For the first time in years, someone had seen through the mask he wore, and it terrified him. But it also gave him a glimmer of hope, a small voice in the back of his mind whispering that maybe, just maybe, she was right. "I don't know how to change," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie took a step closer, her gaze steady and compassionate. "You don't have to do it alone. Let someone in, Ethan. Start with me." The vulnerability in her words struck a chord deep within him. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crack. And though he didn't know what the future held, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to take the first step toward healing. Ethan Cole wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. For years, he had perfected the art of control over his company, his environment, and most importantly, his emotions. But now, standing in front of Sophie Carter, he felt exposed in a way that both terrified and intrigued him. Her words lingered in his mind, chipping away at the walls he had spent a lifetime building. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to push someone away. Sophie could see the conflict in his eyes. She knew she had struck a nerve, but she also knew that change wouldn't come easily for someone like Ethan. "I'm not asking you to fix everything overnight," she said gently. "But you have to start somewhere. Let me help you." Ethan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the photograph of his mother on the desk. The memories of that day, the accident, the guilt, the overwhelming loss flooded his mind. He had spent years convincing himself that keeping people at a distance was the only way to protect himself from more pain. But now, for the first time, he wondered if that isolation had done more harm than good. What if I can't do it? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible. What if I let someone in and it all falls apart again? Sophie stepped closer, her tone soft but firm. You don't have to be perfect, Ethan. No one is. But shutting yourself off from the world isn't the answer. You've already proven you're strong enough to build an empire. Now it's time to prove you're strong enough to let someone in. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Someone who wasn't afraid of him. Someone who wasn't trying to take something from him. Sophie wasn't just a journalist chasing a story. She was someone who understood pain, someone who had faced her own demons and come out stronger on the other side. Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. I don't know where to start, he admitted. Sophie smiled, a small but genuine smile that lit up her face. Start by talking to me. Tell me about her, your mother. What was she like? Ethan hesitated. The words caught in his throat. It had been so long since he had talked about his mother, so long since he had allowed himself to remember the good times without being consumed by the pain of losing her. But as he looked at Sophie, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Trust. She was everything, he said finally, his voice trembling. She was kind, patient, and always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. She used to tell me that I could do anything I set my mind to. She was my anchor. Sophie listened intently, her heart aching for the boy Ethan had been and the man he had become. She sounds like an incredible woman, she said softly. And I think she'd be proud of the man you've become. Ethan shook his head, his expression pained. She wouldn't be proud of this, he said, gesturing to the cold, empty room around him. She wouldn't want me to live like this. Then honor her memory by living the life she would have wanted for you, Sophie said. A life filled with connection, with meaning, with people who care about you. Ethan looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. For so long he had been trapped in a cycle of guilt and fear, unable to move forward, but now, for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he didn't have to do it alone. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe it was time to break down the walls and let someone in. I don't know if I can do this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to do it all at once, Sophie replied. Just take it one step at a time, and if you fall, I'll be here to help you get back up. Ethan nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. It wasn't a complete breakthrough, but it was a start. And for someone like Ethan, who had spent years locked away in his own mind, that was enough. As Sophie turned to leave, she paused at the door and looked back at him. You're stronger than you think, Ethan. Don't forget that. Ethan watched her go, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing in the quiet room. For the first time in years, he felt something other than fear and guilt. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a spark of hope. And as he sat back down at his desk, staring at the photograph of his mother, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to take the first step toward healing. The days following Sophie's visit were unlike anything Ethan Cole had experienced in years. Her words lingered in his mind, challenging the beliefs he had clung to for so long. For the first time, he found himself questioning the life he had built, the isolation, the rigid control, the walls he had erected to keep the world out. It was as if Sophie had planted a seed of doubt, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore it. Ethan sat in his office at Coltech Tower, staring out at the city skyline. The view, once a source of pride and comfort, now felt hollow. He had everything he thought he wanted, power, success, wealth, but none of it seemed to matter anymore. Sophie's voice echoed in his mind. You've built walls to protect yourself, but those walls are keeping you from the very thing you need most. Connection. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Connection. The word felt foreign to him, almost laughable. How could someone like him, A man who had spent years avoiding relationships suddenly opened himself up to others. And yet deep down he knew Sophie was right. His mother wouldn't have wanted this for him. She had always believed in the power of love and human connection, and he had spent years dishonoring her memory by shutting himself off from the world. Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Ryan, his ever-reliable assistant, holding a tablet. "Mr. Cole, the board meeting is in 10 minutes, he said, his tone professional as always. Ethan nodded, but didn't move. "Ryan," he said after a moment, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "do you think I've changed?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the question. In all the years he had worked for Ethan, he had never seen him this vulnerable. "Changed how, sir?" Ethan gestured vaguely, struggling to find the right words. "Do you think I've become too closed off, too distant?" Ryan hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. "You've always been focused, sir, driven. But, yes, I think you've kept people at arm's length. It's part of what makes you so effective, but it's also isolating." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing Ryan's words. "Thank you for your honesty," he said quietly. Ryan hesitated again, then added, "If I may, sir, I think Miss Carter might be onto something. She seems to care about you, and not just as a journalist. Maybe it's worth listening to her." Ethan didn't respond, but Ryan's words stayed with him long after he left the room. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to consider the possibility that Sophie might be right. Maybe it was time to take the first step, no matter how small. That evening, Ethan found himself standing outside Sophie's apartment building. He had spent hours debating whether or not to come, but in the end he couldn't ignore the pull he felt toward her. She had seen through his defenses, challenged him in ways no one else had, and for some reason he trusted her. He knocked on her door, his heart pounding in a way that felt foreign and uncomfortable. When Sophie opened the door, her expression shifted from surprise to curiosity. "Ethan," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I wasn't expecting you." "I wasn't expecting to be here," he admitted, his voice low. "But I couldn't stop thinking about what you said." Sophie gestured for him to sit, and they settled into her small but cozy living room. "What part?" she asked gently. "All of it," Ethan said, his gaze fixed on the floor. "You were right. About the walls, about my mother, about everything. I've spent so long trying to protect myself that I've forgotten how to live, and I don't know how to fix it." Sophie leaned forward, her expression soft and understanding. "The fact that you're here talking to me is a start. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to be willing to try." Ethan looked at her, his defenses crumbling further. "I don't know if I can do this alone." "You don't have to," Sophie said, her voice steady. "I'm here, Ethan, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to take the first step. And as he sat there, talking to Sophie about his fears, his past, and his hopes for the future, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to face the world alone. The days that followed marked a quiet but profound shift in Ethan Cole's life. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to step outside the rigid structure he had built around himself. It wasn't easy. Every step felt like walking on unsteady ground, but Sophie's presence gave him a sense of stability he hadn't realized he needed. She didn't push him too hard or expect him to change overnight. Instead, she simply listened, encouraged, and reminded him that he didn't have to face his fears alone. Ethan began small. He started by spending more time outside his office, walking through the city instead of retreating to his penthouse after work. The bustling streets, once overwhelming and chaotic, now felt alive with possibility. He even began to notice things he had ignored for years: the laughter of children in the park, the warmth of the sun on his face, the simple joy of being part of the world around him. Sophie, true to her word, stayed by his side. She didn't treat him like a project or a story to be written. Instead, she treated him like a person flawed, complicated, and worthy of connection. They spent hours talking, not just about his past, but about hers as well. Sophie shared stories of her father, the pain of losing him, and how she had channeled that pain into her work. Her vulnerability inspired Ethan to open up in ways he never thought possible. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, Ethan turned to Sophie with a rare smile. "You know, I used to think that letting people in was a weakness," he said. "But now I'm starting to see that it takes more strength to let someone in than to keep them out." Sophie smiled back, her eyes warm. "It's not easy, but it's worth it. And you're stronger than you think, Ethan." He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think I would have gotten this far without you." "You would have," Sophie said gently. "It just might have taken a little longer." Ethan chuckled softly, a sound that felt foreign but good. "You're too modest." As their connection deepened, Ethan began to make changes in his professional life as well. He started by addressing the unspoken rule at Coltech Industries that had kept women from advancing in the company. It wasn't an official policy, but his aversion to working with women had created an unspoken barrier that no one dared to challenge, until now. In a meeting with his executive team, Ethan made an announcement that left everyone stunned. "Effective immediately, I want to ensure that Coltech is a place where everyone has an equal opportunity to succeed," he said, his tone firm but sincere. "That includes actively recruiting and promoting women into leadership roles. I've let my personal issues affect this company for too long, and it's time to make things right." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Ryan, who had been by Ethan's side for years, couldn't hide his surprise, but he also couldn't hide his pride. He had seen Ethan's transformation firsthand, and he knew how much courage it had taken for him to make this decision. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan continued to take steps toward healing. He began working with a therapist to address the trauma of his mother's death, something he had avoided for years. He also started to rebuild relationships with people he had pushed away, including old friends and colleagues who had once been close to him. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but Ethan was determined to keep moving forward. Through it all, Sophie remained a constant presence in his life. Their relationship grew from a tentative friendship into something deeper, something neither of them had expected, but both of them cherished. Sophie saw the man behind the walls, the man who was capable of so much more than he gave himself credit for. And Ethan saw in Sophie a light that had been missing from his life for far too long. One evening, as they walked through the park together, Ethan stopped and turned to Sophie. "You've changed my life," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for that." Sophie smiled, her hand brushing against his. "You don't have to repay me, Ethan. Just keep moving forward. That's all I want." Ethan nodded, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time, he felt like he was truly living, not just surviving, but living. And as he looked at Sophie, he realized that the walls he had spent so long building were finally coming down. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a new beginning, and for Ethan Cole, that was more than enough.